What's the creepiest unsolved mystery? A creepy one off the top of my head is the harassment of Bill and Dorothy Wacker, an elderly couple from Ohio. Their house had been ransacked a couple of times between 1984 and 1985. Then, in July of 1985, a stranger knocked on their door whilst Dorothy was home alone recovering from heart surgery, asking to use their phone due to his car apparently breaking down. She thought he'd left after making the call, but then was knocked unconscious by a blow to the head. Dorothy woke up bound and gagged on the kitchen floor but thankfully managed to crawl to an open window to get help from her neighbors, who called the police. Bill then returned home to find his revolver, among a few other things, had been stolen. This was accompanied by the message "cheaper, but will do" scrawled in crayon on one of their walls. 4 months later the revolver turned up on their porch in a bag. The harasser repeatedly phoned the couple, sometimes threatening them and sometimes just breathing deeply down the phone like a creep. Despite changing their phone number multiple times, they were unable to stop the calls. After this, they installed security lights. The harasser responded with a note saying, "Your lights are a laugh." They were frequently left other mocking and scary notes. Dorothy was then attacked once more in 1993, a full 8 years after the original attack, this time being sent to the hospital with skull lacerations. The Wackers staked out their own house after this in an attempt to find the person who had been harassing them. However, they didn't find anything. After the stakeout had been called off, they heard banging at the side of their house and found a note simply saying, "Get the message." After this, as far as I can recall, the harassment abruptly stopped. It really freaks me out. What motive would one have to harass a random old couple? For years and years? They never got close to finding out who did it, and both Bill and Dorothy died without ever finding out who made their lives hell. My family in Michigan had a single-story farmhouse out in the country, and there was some weirdo who would come by usually late at night or in the evening and would be banging on the walls and doors or looking into the windows just staring until someone noticed him. Then he would run off into the woods. It was so bad that my aunt, who was a teenager at the time, would only get jobs that were late second shift or third shift so she wouldn't have to be there for it. They would call the cops, and of course in the middle of nowhere it's not like they could do anything as the guy was long gone by the time they got there. The cops straight up told my grandpa if they ever caught him to beat the brakes off him and drag him through a window so they could arrest him, no questions asked. One night my mom and aunt even went so far as having their friends who ran track and field hide up on the roof waiting for the guy to show up and jump down and grab him to catch him. He showed up banging on the doors and walls, and when they jumped down after him he ran like greased lightning. He blew right past them into the woods like they were standing still. He was so fast that to this day they still flirt with the idea that it was something paranormal, as they said they have never seen a human move so fast in their life. It never stopped for years and years until they moved out. My favorite is probably John Lang's case. Basically, a local activist posts regularly about the Fresno Police Department and about how they were plotting against him. People thought he was crazy until he set up a camera that recorded lots of weird shit, including a bunch of cops parking across the street from his house staring at him in the middle of the night, and a van pulling up with a large camera that people theorized took thermal pictures through walls to see if anyone was inside. He posted that weekend, the police was going to murder him and accurately predicted his death. The police released a report saying that he was stabbed repeatedly in the back and then recanted, saying it was supposedly a suicide of a crazy man. Antoinette Guidito's kidnapping. She let her kidnapper in after he said that he was Uncle Joe, where they threw her into a van. The creepy part is a year later, someone called 911 claiming to be her, and someone shouts in the background who said you could use their phone. And a struggle is heard before the call cuts off. Antoinette's mom said that she was sure it was her daughter's voice. Then 4 years later, a girl matching Antoinette's description was acting strange in a diner, and left a note on a napkin that said, "Please help, call police." She's still missing, and she went missing in 1986. Disappearance of the Sauter children. Christmas Eve, 1945. The Sauter family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia burned to the ground. There's the father, George, the mother, Jenny, and 9 children. 4 of the children escaped, but 5 were believed to have died in the fire. Then, during the search of the burned house, none of the children's remains were found. The fire was nowhere near hot enough to burn through bone, but not a trace of them were found. Here's the freaky part. 2 months before, a visiting salesman told George his house would go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. The salesman attributed this to George's dirty remarks against Mussolini. George, an Italian immigrant, had been outspoken against Mussolini, which angered some in his Italian-American community. Another visitor later told George that his fuse boxes would cause a fire someday. This was after George just had his electricity rewired and inspected to be safe. In the weeks before Christmas, the older Sodder children noticed a car following them through the main town as they walked home from school. During the night of the fire, Jenny was awoken by a strange phone call after midnight, asking for a name she did not know. At 1 a.m., Jeannie heard a loud banging on the house's roof, but went back to sleep when she did not hear anything further. Half an hour later, she smelled smoke. The fire seemed to start near the fuse box. George, Jenny, and 4 of the children who had been sleeping downstairs escaped the house. They yelled to the children upstairs, but heard no response. The fire had already been engulfing the staircase, so they could not rescue them. George tried to go outside, around the house, to use a ladder to climb the window to the attic and rescue the children. But the ladder was not in its usual place. It would be found 75 feet away in an embankment. Then George tried to drive both his truck to the window, then climb them. But neither truck would start, despite both having worked the previous day. Later, a telephone repairman told the Sodders that the house's phone line had not been burned through in the fire, as they had initially thought, but cut by someone. The driver of a bus that passed through Fayetteville late Christmas Eve said he had seen some people throwing balls of fire at the house. Other witnesses claimed to have seen the children themselves. One woman who had been watching the fire from the road said she had seen some of them peering out of a passing car while the house was burning. Years later, in the 60s, Jeannie found in the mail a letter addressed to her, postmarked in Central City, Kentucky, with no return address. Inside was a picture of a young man around 30 with features strongly resembling Louis, who would have been in his 30s if he had survived. On the back was written, "Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Elil boys. A90132 or 35. The Sodders never stopped believing their children were alive, and Jeannie wore black in mourning every day for the rest of her life. The Setagaya family murders. The killer stayed in their house for a while after the murders as if nothing had happened. He allegedly made himself some tea, took a nap, used their computer for a bit and helped himself to some of their ice cream. I feel like someone who is that comfortable being in a house with people he just murdered has done it before and will probably continue as long as they are not caught." Andrew Gosden, smart boy who had a perfect attendance record, skips school to go to a train station to buy a one-way ticket to King's Cross in London on his own. As soon as he leaves the station, he seemingly vanishes in an area crawling with CCTV cameras. None of the CCTV cameras in the entirety of London had saved footage of him, as the police waited 2 weeks before asking local businesses if there was any footage of him saved, and there's no evidence of him ever leaving the city. There's theories he was groomed or got snatched off the street, but that's pretty much impossible to do in such a busy area. He had a PSP on him when he disappeared, but Sony confirmed no PSN account had ever been made on his account. He had no access to the internet at home and didn't even have a mobile phone. Strangely, he left the charger for the PSP at home, suggesting he possibly intended to come back. Delphi Bridge murders. 2 preteen girls were murdered near abandoned train bridge in Indiana 2017. One girl got audio and video of the suspect walking toward them. 2 years later, and is still taking tips from the public. Zeb Quinn. The guy goes missing. His car is found with a live puppy inside, headlights still on, and a pair of lips drawn on the back window with lipstick. The Beaumont children deserves a mention. 3 kids in Adelaide, South Australia, who went down to the beach in 1966 and never came back. They were seen talking to a man, and then walking around the suburb, but that's it. Never came home, never found, nobody ever arrested, police still following tips and digging for bodies more than 50 years later. Kids were like 9, 7 and 4. All 3 just vanished. Parents refused to move from the house for a very long time, in case they ever came home. Does my head in? The body in boiler stack 9. Basically, some maintenance workers found a well-cooked body in the stack of a boiler in the steam plant at a paper mill. Nobody knows who it was, but there are signs that he died very slowly. He was found with his clothes off and wrapped around his feet and hands as if to protect himself from the searing hot metal. The theory is that he was exploring during the weekend when the boiler was off, got stuck, and was unable to alert anyone before they started the boilers back up the following week. The body had been in there for months by the time he was found. Just what happened to MH370? A massive airliner en route from one heavily populated city to another suddenly hangs a hard left before quietly disappearing from radar. No distress signal, no emergency call, just gone. Only one piece of debris ever found, washed up on a beach thousands of miles away. What the hell happened? Edit. Okay, so I don't exactly buy the suicide theory at the moment. It's a distinct possibility, but so is pilot error or mechanical failure. Plus I don't know how trustworthy the sources promoting the suicide theory are, considering some people are pushing it as though we know for sure that's what happened when we most certainly don't. I'll have to check out the links you find people have provided before I decide what I think is the most likely explanation. So apparently about 10 pieces of small miscellaneous debris confirmed to be from 370 have been found, but the aircraft as a whole remains missing. A few years ago 2 Dutch girls went traveling to South/North/Central America, Panama, and they went missing. The phone records were weird. They called 911 multiple times throughout the next few nights. Their camera was found with dozens of random photos taken in the middle of the night, as if they were trying to see using the flash. Then I think they found some body parts, a boot with a foot still inside and a pelvis bone or something. Really creepy. The Bodom Lake Murders. In 1960 in Finland a group of 4 teenagers went camping near Lake Bodom. 2 girls both aged 15 and 2 guys both aged 18. At night 3 of them were killed and the only one of the boys survived. Their bodies and the horribly injured boy were found a few hours before noon. The badly injured boy was laying on top of the bloody tent. If you search for pictures of the tent, you can see that it's completely drenched in blood. The boy was not fully conscious and had several fractures in his skull. He survived and is still alive today with no memory of what happened. The police tried everything to find out what happened. Later in 2005 the survivor was accused of being the murderer. I however do not believe this to be true. Some of the teen's possessions were taken, wallets, shoes etc. Some were later found in the forest 500 meters away. With the injuries he had, walking the distance would have been impossible. Also, why come back to the crime scene? There was also no way this boy could have caused himself injuries to the back of the head. Also, sometimes like the leather jacket from the boy that died still haven't been found. To search for the murderer the largest manhunt in Finland's history was conducted. 88 searched criminals were found in the forests of Espoo as a result, but not the murderer. There were multiple sightings of a light-haired man walking nearby the crime scene before and after the crime. He was never found. Edit. I forgot to tell how they were killed. Their heads were bashed and hit with a big rock/steel rod. They were also stabbed through the tent fabric with a knife. The cause of death for the 3 were head injuries. One of the girls had been stabbed over 10 times. I've posted about this before elsewhere. But the Villisca Axe murders has got to be up there for me. Sometime around midnight between Sunday, June 9th, and Monday, June 10th, 1912, a person bludgeoned to death 8 people sleeping, including 2 adults and 6 children aged 5 through 12. Okay, so maybe creepy to me at least. When I was 5 my dad didn't come to pick me up at the weekend as usual. My parents had been divorced for a few years but were on relatively good terms and co-parenting by all accounts. The next day my mom took me around because I was upset and she was pissed off. No answer at the door but his car and work van were on the drive. She still had a key to the house so let us in to find everything in place. His wallet and keys on the kitchen table, dog in his bed. She fed the dog and went back home. After a couple of days still no contact so she went back round. Everything was just as she found it last time, all belongings and clothes there, his bags and suitcase still in the cupboard, just a hungry dog. She took the dog back with her and spoke to his side of the family. No one had heard from him for about a week but nothing out of the ordinary. A mutual friend at his work said he hadn't been in for a week either and their boss was furious. She called the police and reported him missing. They found no clues, his wallet, keys and cars all at the house, his passport was in the drawer. His petty cash stash of about £500 was where it was always kept. No signs of struggle, no signs of his bank accounts hadn't been touched for a week and no out of the ordinary or large transactions or withdrawals over the previous months. Long story short, they found nothing and eventually shelved the case and 23 years later still no contact with any friends or family. His parents and brother have all since passed away, never knowing what happened. Didn't they keep finding pairs of hands and feet around Hollywood Hills a few years back? I never heard an update on that case. I have a local one that's not very well known. In my country there are some caves in the jungle that are called La Cueva de los Dios. It's a network of caves and there are many mysteries surrounding the caves. One of the theories claims there is a whole underground city under the Andes. Another one claims that there is a hidden library with texts carved in metal that narrate the beginning of humanity. Even Neil Armstrong, a North American astronaut, went inside to explore in 1976. Information is very sparse and in Spanish. But it's very interesting. The boy in the box. A little boy's body was found in a cardboard box in Philadelphia, America. When they examined him, they couldn't find a cause of death. His hair had recently been cut and they speculated that he was living his life as a little girl. The story goes quite deep, but they never found any suspects and it remains a mystery to this day. I remember a story, sadly I don't recall any names, but it was is quite a well-known story, where a German dude disappeared. So, this guy is on vacation with his friends. One night he gets in a fight with some guys at a club. His friends assumed they were Russian but weren't sure, as they were really drunk. Dude goes outside to get some fresh air. His friends follow him. When he wasn't returning, they find him, outside, with a head injury. Apparently the guys from the club returned with some friends to beat him up. The next day he visits a doctor and is diagnosed with a small ear injury. He isn't allowed to fly and get some medicine. He delays his fly home for a week, or so, but not his friends. Now this is where the story gets strange. For the next days this dude sends paranoid messages to his mother and friends, telling them he feels weird, that something is strange and that he is watched and followed by someone. In one of his last messages, he asked his mother to Google the medicine the doctor gave him. On the day of his departure he was filmed and seen at the airport. He was approached by security, I don't know why, and brought into a room. Security later said, he was really nervous and always looking around as if he was expecting to be followed. Suddenly he went into a full panic and stormed out of the room, leaving his backpack and all his belongings behind. Security footage showed him running out of the airport, across the street and into the open fields. That was the last anybody has seen of him. The Anji-Kuni Lake Village disappearance. An entire village of Inuits just up and vanished. Upwards to 25 to 30 people disappeared, leaving behind burning fire pits, clothes with needles in them and rotten food on plates in the homes. There was no sign of struggles or a panic. People just disappeared. The disappearance of Brian Schaffer. In 2006 an Ohio State student went into a bar and never came out. He was out with two friends one night and they went to a bar. This bar had a front main entrance and a back entrance for staff/entertainment, both of which had cameras on them. Brian is seen on camera entering the bar, and then later stepping out of the bar to talk to a couple girls before going back in. Minutes before the bar closed and they were preparing to leave, Brian told his friends he was going to go talk to the band. Brian walked away out of sight and his friends waited for him, but he was never seen again. This was not a large bar, and the band doesn't remember talking to him, and the cameras never caught him exiting the bar. No one knows what happened to Brian after he walked away from his friends or how, or if, he left the bar. This is all from memory, but I really suggest looking more into this one because there are a lot more details that make it even more baffling. There are many things that could both point to and away from Brian disappearing intentionally. It's such a wild case. One of the things I remember that I thought was really interesting was that an FBI agent who was specialized in facial recognition spent a long time analyzing the security footage and watched every person who came out of the bar. He never identified Brian leaving, but years later after he had stopped working on it he was at an Ohio State football game and saw someone across the crowd that he couldn't help but think looked very much like Brian. It was so similar to Brian that the guy had to go and talk to him. It turns out it was Brian's brother. That's how good this guy was. About 3 years ago I was broken into. They stole essentially all my life savings, which was in precious metals, along with a bunch of other miscellaneous personal belongings. The police never found them. 3 days later, I see my door is broken in again and thieves came back and put a couple things back, including a gold ounce coin with a note attached that my dad had written to me when I was an infant, telling me he loved me. Less creepy, just strange, criminals with a conscience. The disappearance of Trevor Deely in Ireland in December 2000. 22-year-old, vanished after a work party. All kinds of theories have been posted about it, but nothing has ever explained his disappearance. I can't even imagine what his family have been going through. The Dyatlov Pass incident. 10 experienced hikers set out on an expedition in the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union. Their trip is well documented, both with camera shots and writings, because they were testing for an elite mountaineering instructing license. One member, Yuri Yudin, has to turn back because of a flare-up of old health issues. He agrees to meet them in the town they were supposed to arrive at on February 12. On February 20th, still no sign of them. Rescuers send out a party and find the following: the tent abandoned with all of their shoes in it. Keep in mind, this is a Russian winter and very experienced travelers. The tent appears to have a large slash on the back made from the inside, as if there had been something blocking the front of the tent. The 9 bodies were scattered, 6 appearing to have died of hypothermia, 3 from apparent physical trauma. 1 victim had a fractured skull, 2 others had major chest trauma. According to the doctor who examined them, the force required to cause the damage sustained would have been extremely high, comparable to the force of a car crash. One of the victims, perhaps most disturbingly, was missing her tongue and eyes. None were wearing shoes. 2 victims were dressed only in underwear. Again, I cannot stress to you enough how experienced these people are. One was a World War II vet with 4 medals, from a division with 80% fatality. It was a running joke in his division that you only got 1 to 2 medals, because then you either were unfit for duty or dead. And he had 4. It was documented that some compelling force must have made the 9 hikers flee their tents. No one knows what that force could have been. There are many intriguing theories, but all seem to have some bit of contradicting evidence making them seem implausible. There's a book called Dead Mountain by Donnie Eicher that provides a compelling case that high winds traveling over the geography of the mountain produced infrasound, which induces vertigo, fear, and panic. Eicher researched the incident for years, and rehiked much of their path in winter conditions with Russian experts in the case. The most popular alternative theories can be discounted pretty easily. The slope of the mountain at the campsite is much too shallow to support an avalanche. Nearby weapons/missile tests were well documented and did not occur on the night in question. There were no other footprints to suggest armed invaders. Wind alone could not have blown away any of the hikers without destroying the tent as well. Eicher posits that as the storm grew stronger and began producing infrasound, the anxiety of hikers escalated until the only solution was to flee in senseless panic. The tent entrance was tied closed to keep out the wind, which created impatience to escape and led to slashing the tent side. A few hundred yards from the tent, the infrasound abated and the scattered hikers began to address their situation. 2 managed to start a fire under some cedar trees, but still succumbed to hypothermia. Some tried to work back towards the tent, but in the darkness and swirling snow they had next to no chance of successfully returning. The hikers with severe trauma had stumbled over a rocky cliff that sits between the campsite and the location where they were found. The bodies of that group were hidden beneath snow for over a month, and were found in a severe state of decomposition. The missing organs can be explained by the faster decomposition rates of those tissues. While the narrative is compelling, the only thing the Eicher book neglects to do is provide solid measurements of infrasound conditions at the pass. It's probably a very rare occurrence, and climate change may make it impossible to replicate now, but a long-term monitoring station at the campsite could answer the question conclusively. Then again, the cost of that probably greatly outweighs the benefit of solving a 50-plus-year-old mystery. Correct me if I'm wrong, but did they ever actually catch the Zodiac Killer? Been a while since I read anything about it, so things could have changed, but from what I remember they were never caught. Happened during the football championship 2006 in Germany. A girl named Frauke Liebs was watching a game with friends, and texting her roommates not to worry, she would come home late. After leaving the pub at around 11 p.m. no one ever saw her alive again. Now the strange part. In the following week she texted and called a friend and her parents stating that she's alright and will come back soon, although with an unusual sleepy voice. At her last call she accidentally said yes when her sister was asking if she's been held against her will and instantly correcting to a no. This was the last time someone heard of her. Her corpse was found in the woods close to where she disappeared 3 months later with no indication who her killer is. The one where the woman was acting weird in an elevator looking around and then just kind of disappeared and got found in a water tank on top of the hotel. Can't remember her name, but it's pretty odd. Black Dahlia 1000%, cut in half and completely drained of blood, left somewhere posed for maximum effect. It still gives me the heebs. No matter how you look at it or what theory you subscribe to, none really 100% fit, and even if you consider it solved by a theory, someone still did this to that poor woman. Literally terrifying. Also, as a warning, pretty grim pics pop up if you image search, so be warned. I live in a row house built in the 1880s in Baltimore, Maryland. Back in 1912, the owner of the house, Anthony Wall, age 65, committed suicide by hanging in the basement. Anthony, who was wheelchair-bound, somehow got down these stairs. He then somehow hanged himself by attaching clothesline to the rafters. His wife, who had gone shopping at the market, was only gone for a half an hour. She left Anthony in the parlor of the home, located in the front of the house. For Anthony to have gotten to the basement stairs, he would have had to wheel himself back a long hallway in the house, and then wheel back down a long brick walkway to get to the bulkhead. He would have also had to open the bulkhead to get down the stairs. My mom, who's in her 70s but rather nimble, had problems opening the bulkhead by herself without my help. This is the floor plan of the first story of the house. For reference, I have, crudely, drawn his route to the basement. Anthony and his wife, Fanny, were supposed to go to the country for a visit later that afternoon, and he was reportedly in good spirits. When Fanny returned from the market, she asked Fanny, their servant, who had only been hired the previous day, if she had seen him. They then went on to search the house. Fanny, the wife, I know the names are confusing, went to the basement and found poor Anthony. I have these two articles regarding the event. Found husband hanging on rope, cuts down dead husband. I did a bunch of research into the family, but it's a doozy of a story that I won't go into unless there's interest. I'll edit this post, if so. There's a lot of mysteries surrounding the family, which was a prominent part of the community and very wealthy. They owned several properties and had a very successful hat business. I used to work as a genealogist and worked in history museums, and I have spent entirely too long on this story. Either it's a horribly sad story, or something more sinister happened. There are also other suicides and mental health issues that affected the family. However, they all happened after this event. In fact, his nephew that we was named after him, eventually spent decades in a state hospital, mental health. I doubt I'll ever find out what happened, but I just can't stop wondering. Edit. This is a super long story, but you guys asked for it. The story of Anthony Wall. Anthony Wall was born about 1843 in Baltimore City, Maryland, and came from a family of milliners. Anthony's family owned a couple of hat stores and several properties throughout the neighborhood. They were rather wealthy and were prominent members of the community. Anthony's parents were Jacob and Joanna Wall, both German immigrants. Jacob died in 1882, and left a huge estate to his wife. Although Anthony was the oldest child, in 1884 his mother sold the hat store to her son-in-law, George H. Buduk, who was married to Anthony's sister Juliana. Though I couldn't find any information about what happened to the hat store after this event, I do know that George went on to open a paint store that is still around today. It was located in the next neighborhood over until it burned down last year and moved out to the county. It was a big part of the community for decades. Around that same time, Anthony opened up his own millinery and notions shop in his house. In June of 1901 the business is listed for rent, due to ill health. I couldn't find any other information about the business, though. Sometime in the 1880s Anthony married Fanny Wall. Fanny was born in Germany in November of 1847. She, too, was a milliner, but there's not a ton of information about her out there. They seem to have a happy marriage, and there are several notices about trips they took together and even a large surprise party that Anthony had for her birthday in 1906. For reasons I cannot track down, at some point Anthony ends up being wheelchair-bound. The house where they live is 3.5 stories tall and has a basement down some rather steep stairs. The basement does have low ceilings and it is very treacherous getting down to the ground. The event. On May 7, 1912, Fanny goes to the market early in the morning, leaving her husband with a cheery farewell. He was apparently in excellent spirits when she left, and they were both looking forward to a trip out to the country they were taking that very afternoon. She left him in the parlor and was gone not more than a half an hour. When Fanny first arrived home, she asked her servant, named Fanny and had only started working for them the day before this event, where he was, who told her she thought he had gone out. Fanny then called out for Anthony, searches upstairs, don't know why, wheelchair, and then ultimately ended up in the basement, that had an exterior entrance at the end of a long, brick-lined hallway. She then found him hanging by a single clothesline flung over a beam in the basement. Fanny runs back up the stairs and back to the kitchen to grab a knife and cuts down Anthony, but it was too late, he was already dead. An overturned soapbox was found a short distance from the body, described by the Baltimore Evening Sun as a poignant suggestion as to the manner of the deed. In the meantime, Fanny, the servant, had already run a few doors down to fetch a doctor. Fanny was almost incoherent, but was able to describe her husband's earlier good spirits and her utter shock in her new reality. Other interesting details. In Anthony's funeral announcement, I noticed that he wasn't buried in the same cemetery as his parents, though both Juliana and her husband George H. Budick were in the same plot. His mother, Joanna, died in 1906. When she died, she left 2 houses to Anthony, but 5 houses to George, along with several other lots of land. I don't know if she left less to Anthony because he had no children or if there was some other reason. I eventually tracked down that Anthony was buried in a Jewish cemetery, and assumed that perhaps that is why he was almost shunned from the family. Fanny's family was Jewish. A wedding notice for Juliana and George listed a minister of the UU faith, but I don't know enough about religion to know if that would have been relevant. There are other instances that show some sort of rip in the family, but I've already droned on enough. Whatever happened in the family, it seemed to happen around the time he married Fanny, who had come from a poor immigrant Jewish family that lived in a poorer part of the city. Maybe Anthony's family looked down upon her? I just know that they really didn't end up with nearly as much wealth as his siblings. I also wonder if she felt that he was a burden, being in a wheelchair. Honestly, my mom and I have been in the basement several times trying to figure how he got down there and then how he could have actually hanged himself. It just doesn't make sense. She was supposedly only gone for a half an hour and I just don't see a way for him to have the time to do the deed. My questions: was Fanny resentful or didn't want to deal with him? There is a lot of evidence of depression in the Wald family. I can provide details, if needed, and perhaps he was himself depressed because of his disability and took it out on her. Maybe it was the servant that had only started with him the day before. I don't know if anyone else will read as much into this story, but it just doesn't seem that Anthony had the physical means to do it. I have dozens of articles about various things with both Anthony and Fanny's families. Here is the ancestry page for Anthony and his Fanny's that I made, as there wasn't anything about them anywhere. It contains information about Anthony's nephew, Juliana's son, Anthony Budick, who lived in the Springfield State Hospital for a decade or two and was married several times. One of Fanny's nephews also committed suicide, apparently brought on by getting caught embezzling money from his boss. Obviously, I don't think I'll ever know exactly what happened. Maybe you guys can give some insight. Thanks for reading. I should agree. 10-year-old girl got up in the middle of the night, packed her backpack and left home. A year later, her backpack was found buried inside a duct tape bag, 30 miles away in a construction site. She was seen multiple times walking alongside of a road during the stormy night. The Mary Celeste is one of my favorites. In November of 1872, the American brigantine Mary Celeste set off from New York for Genoa, Italy, with 10 people aboard. Nearly a month later, a British ship spotted the Celeste adrift some 400 miles east of the Azores, an archipelago off the coast of Portugal. Save for a few feet of water in the hold, the ship was perfectly undamaged and still contained 6 months' worth of food and water. The cargo was untouched, and the crew's belongings were still in their quarters. However, not a single soul could be found on board. One of the lifeboats was missing, but the crew was never seen again. Multitudes of explanations have been offered, particularly after an investigation at the time found no evidence of foul play. Today, the fate of the Mary Celeste remains largely a mystery. Pirates probably would have left the ship in a worse state, and mutiny seems unlikely to historians. I don't know about you, but my money is on sea monsters. It's not considered a mystery, but it's one for my family that eats at me. My aunt officially died due to a drug overdose. She lived in a tiny town on the border near Canada, the kind where everyone knows everybody. She was living alone but had a boyfriend and fellow drug user apparently. However, we never met nor saw him. She apparently was well known around the town as kind of a tramp and would hit on and cause problems with several guys around town, including those who were married, like the sheriff. What makes it strange is the combination of drugs she had used which killed her. were reported in doses massively higher than even a drug user would have gone with, almost like she was forced to odd. The boyfriend found her dead in the kitchen and vanished. The sheriff of town was one of the people who really didn't like her, and the coroner had her body cremated immediately so we couldn't even see the body. Nobody authorized it or was even told. We found out when we were fighting to bring the body to another place to be cremated, and at the end of it my grandfather couldn't handle the stress, gave up and let him do the cremation. He handed over the ashes too fast after the approval to have not already done it prior. We went up there and cleaned her place out, put it up for market and such. We ate lunch there. Got a lot of strange and concerning looks at the bar when they found out we had something to do with my aunt, and never went back. The whole thing had a strong overarching vibe that she pissed off the wrong people. Several were people in power. She was forced to odd by somebody, the sheriff was in on it, and the coroner was paid off to do the job before anyone could contest the evidence. But she also lived so absurdly far away from any other family that we didn't stick around long enough to ask too many questions. Cleaned the place out over a weekend and got the hell out of there. My dad went back one additional weekend just to paint the place. She was a chain smoker and he just coated the walls with fresh thick paint to cover it up. The house was sold 8 months later and nobody wants to raise any questions now that it's finished. It gives me chills trying to think about it. Because the only two explanations were that she was killed off for sleeping with the wrong husband, or she committed suicide on drugs alone out of the blue, and the sheriff and coroner are just small-town hicks and semi-incompetent at their job. There are enough missing details to the story that it doesn't give a clean picture. The murder of Terry Sutter. A 15-year-old boy was found murdered in 1975. He was severely beaten and basically drowned in sand. His lungs were crunchy to the touch. The worst part is, after he was buried, his grave was vandalized so frequently that his family had to take down his grave marker and leave his grave unmarked. Who hated a 15-year-old that much they couldn't even leave his grave alone. Pales in comparison to a lot of what's posted here, and the prevailing theory really kills the creepy vibe of it. But it was unsettling AF to me for a long time. The disappearance of the Sarah Jo in 1979. 5 men set out in a 16-foot fishing boat named the Sarah Jo off the coast of Hawaii just prior to a storm, and they never returned. A massive search ensued and turned up nothing. One of the men involved with the search was marine biologist John Norton. Okay, so some dudes went out on a boat and died in a storm. What's creepy? In 1988, on a remote atoll some 2,000 miles away from where the boat launched on that fateful day in 1979, the wreckage of the Sarah Jo was discovered. Nearby the wreckage of the boat was a makeshift grave built with a pile of rocks, containing human remains, most distinctively a jawbone protruding from the pile, and a book of foil sheets. The man who discovered the remains of the Sarah Jo, marine biologist John Norton, who was on a completely unrelated expedition almost 10 years after the search for the Sarah Jo had ended. The disappearance of the men and the makeshift grave aren't all that strange. Obviously, bad weather on the ocean will swallow up a small boat in seconds, and the makeshift grave is explained as possibly related to a Chinese custom of honoring the dead by sending them to the afterlife with fortune, the foil papers representing fortune. So the theory is that the boat and the remains were likely discovered by Chinese fishermen who didn't know what else to do other than provide a proper burial for whomever they had discovered. What remains creepy/unsettling to me, John Norton himself being the one that discovered the boat. He's a marine biologist. So okay, he's out there more often than most, but he is the one that found the boat, not any of the people he was with, him. A government survey of the atoll only 6 years prior surely would have discovered the boat if it had been there, which suggests that it had been possibly adrift in the ocean for at least 3 or 4 years before ending up on the island. It is argued that the channel between the reefs and islands was far too narrow for the boat to naturally end up where it did, which suggests human interference. Again, not all that creepy if you consider the likelihood that a Chinese fisherman fishing illegally discovered it and simply dragged it to that location. However, the boat's engine was found not too far away wedged in some coral, so it's possible it was either dislodged when the boat was manually moved, or a storm somehow pushed the boat to its final resting place and the engine came off during that time. Either way, we're talking at least 4 years of the boat being adrift. And only Scott Mormon's remains were found. Dental records identified the jawbone as that of Mormon, and they were able to identify the other remains as well. So again, while not creepy in an ethereal sense, it is very unsettling to think that Mormon was the last man alive on the Sarah Jo and that his remains had been adrift for a minimum of 3 to 4 years, maybe longer. So the creepy/unsettling question that remains is, what happened on that boat? Did the other 4 men fall overboard during the storm? Did they die one by one while adrift, and get dumped into the ocean by the remaining survivors? How long did Mormon survive by himself, adrift on the Sarah Joe, and where might the remains of the other 4 men have ended up? If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.